Okay, welcome back to the Investigative Journal on this May 7th, 2015 day on our calendar on this rainy Thursday morning. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com, and I'm your host, Greg Anthony, like I said, and you can catch my show every evening from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. That's on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. The last couple of days I've been going through some dental work, and so I'm not, 100%, but you know something, 50% of this show is better than 100% of a lot of the alternative shows out there, as well as the mainstream media, which you can't count on anything anymore. I mean, it's a joke to begin with, and I take it from somebody who worked in the mainstream for years. That's me. Yep, I wanted to be a journalist because I thought I could learn the truth, and boy, was I wrong. But, you got to learn the hard way all the time. And anyway, everything's backwards anyway in this country. What's wrong is right, what's right is wrong, black is white, white is black. And I'm telling you, once you start researching a lot of these stories, you start really seeing what we're living under. And how do you manage to do that? Well, I spent a couple shows telling you about that last week. And another thing today I wanted to mention, I'm going to give you some comments. I spend a lot of time researching Christian ministries that have been persecuted by the Vatican and the government who works for them. And I've concentrated on a number of them, one being the Tony Alamo ministry, because it really tells you what's happening in this country and who is behind it. Because I said a long time ago, it's not only a secular fight, it's a religious fight, a spiritual fight. And I asked myself, I said, let's use a little common sense here. Now, for those of you who don't know anything about what happened to this ministry, Tony Alamo has been under the microscope since he started criticizing and talking against the Vatican and really telling people what really is going on behind the scenes. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I've checked out a lot of different Protestant churches, and any time that I talk to these pastors, they're not willing to speak up about the Antichrist being the Vatican, and then going deeply into the problems this country faces. Now, I saw the difference in Tony Alamo, and then I noticed that for the last 40 years, they have been persecuting this guy. Now, in 2008, it was the final one. They had this thing planned for years, what they wanted to do to this guy, and they had coerced 4 or 5 girls to testify against him. And when you piece apart all that testimony, you find that these charges are bogus, and the guy's been framed. Now, he's spending 175 years in jail. Ministry, not only did they want to put him away, but they wanted to disband this ministry for their religious beliefs. That simple. And if you start looking at this deeply, you'll see that after his kangaroo court trial took place, what they did was they decided to use Children and Family Services to kidnap children so they could really disband the people that were involved in the ministry. And when you see the horrors of things going on with those, how they took over 35 children, still to this day their parents haven't seen them. And I've talked to many of the parents, and I just want to spend a moment on this before I get back to looking at something that was submitted to the U.S. Senate Committee on Finance regarding this religious persecution of the Alamo ministry back in the 90s, to show you that this has been a pattern. Now, let's talk about the kids for a minute. And I've interviewed a number of parents, some who, told me this. They said, basically, the government told me that if I would lie about Tony Alamo, if I would help them prosecute him, they'd get their children back tomorrow. Now, few of these parents could not do that. And so they have not seen their children. Now, what more evidence do you need than to hear that? And I choose to believe these people over the lying government that I've dealt with for years. Now, one thing I wanted to mention. A little bit more information came across my desk regarding some more of these parents, and I've gotten some documentation on that. And regarding that, let me just paraphrase some things here and tell you a few things. Another mother had her boys taken, but her girls escaped with their dad. So what they were trying to do is they were rounding up all these kids from the three or four ministries across the country that he had built up over the years. And their idea was to put them into foster care. And we know the horrors about that. And I'm going to talk about that again tomorrow. Also, Nancy Schaefer, the Georgia senator who was killed because of the things that she was trying to show Americans regarding this horrible system that really inspires kidnapping. And if you don't believe me, just look at what Clinton did from the federal level, providing incentives to states, the Child Protective Services. The more kids they could round up, the more money they would make. And boy, that leads to corruption. Now, another father in the Tony Lamo ministry had his son stolen, but his daughter and other son escaped with their mom. The mother and dad stayed and kept fighting through the court system. They were in real inquisitions. This was another, when you look at this, I've got the testimony of these kids, what they tried to do to these kids, and what they're doing to these parents is nothing more than an inquisition. And I'm going to get into a couple things regarding the Vatican in a minute, but let me finish this. So these mother and father kept fighting, trying to get their kids back, right? They were drilled over a dozen times by Arkansas Department of Human Services lawyers who were all at a hearing and took turns interrogating, passing each pitfall, distraught parents to each other. The judges were hand in hand with these Arkansas attorneys and granted all the attorneys' requests. When one of the mothers and fathers refused to say where their children were located, which they probably didn't even know, because they basically were trying to protect them, the judge, in this case, his name was Griffin, of Texarkana, held them in contempt and threw them in jail for 10 months. So these parents are trying to protect their kids from this system that would have basically, if you look at how they destroy lives in the foster care system, it's incredible. Now, another mother who was pregnant, whose children were taken, was drilled so intensely that she went into labor and had to go to the hospital. They gave her 1 day off and made her return to court. All their parental rights in these cases have been terminated. But one of the key facts, if you look into this, every one of these cases that I looked into, there was no abuse ever shown. None. So what instigates people to take, for the government to do this? And I said a long time ago, I've gotten quotes. I've checked out what Pope John Paul II said about these type of ministries. And in kind of cloak and dagger words, he said, this is the last, these are the last vestiges of dissidents, religious dissidents in America. You know, they've got the rest of the Protestant churches under their ecumenical wing. And it's ministries like this. It's people, and those of you who are involved in the ministry, but read the Bible and understand who the Antichrist is. You're under siege as well. And so basically the Vatican has set up a system where they use our government and all of our authorities to come down on anybody that wants to speak out, read the Bible, interpret it, talk up against really how this beast works. And that's why they've tried to shut Tony down for 40 years. Now, let's look at this thing. And what they do is they label these kind of ministries cults. Then they go after them with IRS violations. Now, if there's ever a cult, now you people that are doing these prosecutions, you paid lawyers and shills who sit there and just, blindly take away the rights of your fellow citizens. Think about this. If you really understand anything, which you don't, the biggest cult in the world is the Vatican. Listen, every one of the charges that you can see going against these Christian ministries is exactly what the Vatican does in reality. But they're protected. I mean, if you don't think they're protected, you can't even get when John Levy brought a case against them with the survivors. It's called Alperin v. Vatican Bank, a federal case in the 9th District up in San Francisco. This case went on for 10 years. And the reason they brought it was that the surviving family members of the victims of a Vatican genocide in Yugoslavia after World War II were trying to get reparations. And when you looked at the evidence of what they did, and even, government officials coming forward in deposition saying, yes, the Vatican was involved not only in stealing the gold, stealing property, but involved in killing these people, the Ninth Circuit basically stated the Vatican doesn't do business in the United States. And so they dropped the case. They don't do business in the United States. You know how much property they own, how many taxes they don't pay, how many pedophile priests are out there. I mean, if they use the same standards that they're using against the Alamo ministry, they should shut down every Catholic church and every school in the country and go after all the kids that are in Catholic schools. But they're not going to do that because that's not the object here. The object is to cut out any type of criticism so that people never get to the truth about understanding this beast. That's really what's going on. So, use your common sense when you really think about it, and take it from me. Since I grew up a Catholic, I know that I was born into this cult, and I'm out of it. Now listen to this. If you don't think they have been messing with these, I told you I'm doing 2 screenplays. One on Tupper Saucy, who wrote a book called Rulers of Evil. And the more I do these, the more I learn about really how this beast operates. And when he came out with a book called Miracle on Main Street, which was really an indictment of our financial system, which was gaining a lot of followers during the 80s and 90s, or the early 80s, when no one was talking about this stuff. They had to try to clamp down on him. And they checked him out. He was doing some research on really who killed Martin Luther King. And basically they used the IRS to try and put him in jail. And they did. They convicted him of a misdemeanor, which, if you look at the charge, I couldn't even find the law in the books. And normally a person with that kind of misdemeanor would get a slap on the hand and maybe a $1,000 fine, but they put him in jail. Wanted to put him in jail for 18 months, but guess what he does? He says, no, I'm not going in. Goes on the lam for 10 years, finds out the prosecutor in his case was a Jesuit priest, researches the Vatican, and exactly what Tony Alamo was saying for years about the Vatican, coming out with a book called Rulers of Evil, which I have right in my hand here. And in the end, after 10 years of research, he publishes the book. They find him in Venice. He spends 18 months in jail. And then about a couple of years after he got out, he died or either was killed. So anyway, then I'm doing one on Tony. And I've talked about how these 2 stories really show you both sides of the coin and how they operate, how the Vatican really operates. And when I said they've been after this group for their religious beliefs, I'm looking at something. They've paid for false witnesses, paid and bribed and threatened people to testify against this ministry. I've had on the record 3 or 4 undercover agents who have come across and said, yes, we were hired to bring this ministry down and to frame this guy. All right. Now, there's a group back in the 90s when there was still some vestige of religious freedom, maybe a sliver of it. The International Coalition for Religious Freedom decided to highlight this case and send it to the Finance Committee and state, listen, this is an IRS abuse of this pastor. And they said the following case is respectfully submitted for inclusion in the Finance Committee hearings, records of IRS abuses of April 28, 29th, May 1, 1998. So this goes back a long way. We bring to your attention the religious persecution case of Pastor Tony Alamo. Alamo was the subject of a 20-year IRS investigation that violated his First Amendment rights and his rights to due process under the law. In June of 94, he was wrongly convicted of filing a fraudulent income tax return for 1985 in violation of 26 U.S.C. 7206. And failing to file income returns for the years 1986 through 88, 2 counts 2 to 4 in violation of 26 U.S.C. 7203. He was sentenced to an unduly harsh 6-year prison sentence, which will end in 1998. So they're writing this while he's in jail. I think he spent 4 years. Now, I have checked out what they tried to do here, and they were all bogus claims. Now, if they wanted to use the same standards, they could put every bishop in this country in jail for 100 years, the way the Vatican flaunts our system. But they're allowed to do that. And the reason they are is because they're part of the beast. They work together with our government for a reason. What is their reason? A one world order and a one world think tank religion that they control, so that they can control your mind, body, and soul. And that's the end game. And every year it gets worse. Now, in June of, so he's wrongly convicted of these, recent released Freedom of Information documents, however, exposed that Alamo, the pastor of this ministry and Music Square Church, was the victim of improper conduct by IRS investigators who went to great extremes to secure a conviction. New evidence proves that the IRS lied to the jury, withheld information and pertinent documentation from the defense, intimidated witnesses, and relied on unreliable witnesses and anti-religious hate organizations who had ulterior motives and used the IRS, a supposed neutral government agency, neutral my foot, for their own ends. In addition, the IRS staged an unnecessary armed raid on church members, all citizens of this country, who were neither dangerous nor violent and did not possess any arms. This was back in the 90s they did this, folks. Now, I said a long time ago, okay, Tony spent 4 years in jail, and if he would have just kept quiet, they might have just left him alone. But he didn't. After he got out, and even in jail, he talked even more. And so they had to figure out another way. So they kept hounding him, and finally in 2008, we've documented that raid, the conviction, 175 years in jail, the kidnapping of all their children, and now they're also filing civil cases to dismantle the property and take that over. That's where we're at in this long chain of persecutions against someone who basically read the Bible. They don't like you to do that. What do you think? Many schools, it's illegal to have a Bible in the schools right now, in public schools. Now, the IRS, according to this freedom organization, unconstitutionally determined that Pastor Alamo's church was illegitimate. Well, if they, let me add this. If the IRS can prove that, they could prove every Catholic church is illegitimate. But they don't even bother. And took away its tax exemption. Well, why not take away the Vatican's tax exemption? And then set out to prove that all church income was generated solely for the benefit of one person. Well, let me tell you something. When you start looking at the money that the Vatican launders in the banks in Italy, I was there in the 80s. Oh, it makes this case look like, a nickel and dime penny drug, kid walking into the drugstore and taking a gumball. You don't realize, folks, what they do there in Rome and even in this country, and how they abuse the system, and anybody who criticizes them that has any amount of success whatsoever gets this type of treatment. Now, the IRS claimed Alamo was the owner of numerous businesses that were in reality owned by the church. Do you know how many businesses the Vatican owns? Hell, they own they own high interest in the Bank of America. Look at their corporations that they own. They invest in all, it's insane. And where does that money go? To the benefit of Rome and to the benefit of a world power that wants to put us to war. Now, look, I dare to say that any penny that this ministry made never went to terrorist organizations to fund them in arms, give them weapons. The money the Vatican creates in charitable organizations it went to Hitler, it went to Mussolini, it went to Stalin, and now it's going to ISIS. But they're not a cult, no. They're one true church of God. Give me a break. Because when you start really wanting to get to the truth, my dear IRS friends and all of my government friends out there who are clamoring at any kind of person who, wants to read the Bible or do anything, just check out where their money goes. The money laundering in the Vatican Bank, the money laundering in this country that goes to support these terrorist groups that are causing our problems right now. You don't want to go there, do you? Because you'd lose your job. Yeah, it's that simple. Now, got a couple minutes before the break. So, basically, how, and then they said, he diverted funds for his own use. But in order to convict him, the IRS had to establish that he exerted absolute control over both the members of the church and the businesses of MSC. To prove this theory, the IRS readily adopted the language of the theories of Cult Awareness Network. This CAN organization, an anti-religious hate organization that attacked churches and religions that they deemed were illegitimate. And guess who controls that organization? If they really wanted to stop any type of hate organization, an anti-religious group, they go right to the snake's source, and that's the Vatican. Because in the end, that's what they're just deceiving. The Vatican is just great at lying. And what they'll do is they'll go after these groups, going after them and falsely framing them for things that the Vatican cult really does. Like I said, everything's black. What's black is white. What's white is black. And what's right is wrong, and what's wrong is right. We have an upside-down turvy system, and topsy-turvy system that you can't get to the truth, at least unless you understand what I'm saying here. And like I said, this is not hate. I'm talking about an organization that funds terrorism, that has funded Hitler, that has funded Stalin, that works together with, our government who, gave us lies about 9/11, etc. And all they do is they basically state this: we will lie to you to the ends of the earth and you will never get to us because we have too much power. And we're going to turn everything around on you and say you're the one that hates God and country. Yep, that's how they work. That's it. And there has never been any one bit of hatred that's ever come out of that ministry. And most of the people that I talk to really want to get to the bottom of the truth and see why their country's going to hell in a handbasket. It has nothing to do with hate speech. But they're going to turn it around and say yes. Well, I tell them to look at the facts. We'll be back in 3 minutes on the Investigative Journal.
Hear it first on FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net.
Have you read the last prophecy? The book of Revelation. Who can understand it? We believe that God wrote His Word to us for our understanding and salvation, on which so many diverse Christians believe in the same fundamental principles. But not so the prophecy of Daniel and Revelation. Has God, by His Holy Spirit, given a sure interpretation to these mysterious passages through the centuries? Yes, He has. The only difference to the individual is on which side of each prophecy he stands in time, before or after, past or future. The last prophecy is as much a book of history fulfilling prophecy, exposed in such a way as to leave you without a doubt. Because we are living near the end of this era, we should be able to understand the substantial amount of the revelation which has already come to pass. Get the book, The Last Prophecy, which is an abridgment of E.B. Elliott's Jorge Apocalypticae, the most comprehensive work ever done on the Revelation, condensed down to a mere 258 pages. You will come away with numerous, incontrovertible revelations into the book of Revelation to easily dispel all of the futurist confusion which has become so popular over the last century. Visit the shopping page at FirstAmendmentRadio.com to get your copy. Get 20% off when you buy it at the FirstAmendmentRadio.com shop.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host, Melody Cedarstrom, right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free, 1-800-375-4188.
Okay, we're back for the second half hour of the Investigative Journal, and I want to mention that you can catch all my shows that are archived on my website. That's at arcticbeacon.com, and you can go there and get all my shows. I put them up, and they go way back, so go and check out some of the older stories. And I've been covering this story for a long, long time, and the more I cover it, the more I see how the religious and the secular world collide here and how they work together. And until you can understand the grasp this kind of the beast in Rome, I lived there for years in Rome and saw it firsthand. And maybe it was a blessing in disguise that I did, because it gives me an idea that what I'm saying to you isn't strictly based on theory. It's based on facts. It's based on as much information as you can get when you have an organization. And just look, I mean, most of the information that we get is skewed. Our historical information is. You know, when you try to get the truth about history, that's difficult. And you try to piece together. But what I've found is there's an organization that keeps records of this stuff. It's in the Vatican archives. That's why they protect them probably more than Fort Knox is protected. And I wish just for one day you could get in there and see really what they're, you know, and although I know what they're all about anyway, it'd be nice to have that information so people then would go, hey, okay. Now we got it, but they protect that. But you can't get in there; it's impossible. Well, here's the deal. So they, going back to this, they use this cult awareness network to basically go after groups that criticize the Vatican and the government. And now it's getting to a point where we're not going to be able to do that anymore. Even though, you know, the reason you do it, America always has supposedly been set up on the fact that your government is small, the people have a large interest in this country, and if there are people in our government who are trying to bring this country down, we have a legitimate right to expose them, as well as religious organizations that do the same thing. It's not hate. It's basically, listen, you know, we don't want to revolt. We don't want to change, you know, and we don't want to run away. All we want to do is give you the truth, so that people can all understand why the world is in the shape it is in today. Now, A brief history. So they try to prove that any group like this is basically illegitimate. Now, Pastor Alamo and his wife, his original wife, Susan Alamo, is now deceased, they built basically a Christian ministry by going out on the streets of California back in the early 70s, late 60s, preaching to young people, many who were drug addicts, criminals, and hippies. And that was during that time when they were basically creating the drug culture in this country and the government profiting immensely from it. Now, in 1969, they incorporated, which was granted a tax-exempt status. As a result of their work, hundreds of youths turned to the church for salvation, and the church grew quickly. As it grew, it also attracted attention from Ken. Oh, yeah. Acting as the almighty arbiter of religious correctness, made a fortune cult-baiting churches that they did not like. And Can psychologists charged susceptible parents thousands of dollars to deprogram their children. Man, going to a Catholic school and wish somebody would have programmed me when I was there. Can has since been forced into bankruptcy for these practices after a jury fined them $4 million for religious persecution and for illegally kidnapping and deprogramming young men and women. But they used this testimony to bring down this ministry, right? They're a great organization, correct? Yeah. Well, while there per se is nothing illegal, put that in quotes, with the government seeking Can's help, what is illegal is for the government to adopt the perspective of an organization like Can. And they used a cult awareness organization in the 2008 framing and conviction of Tony Alamo and the kidnapping of the children in the same manner. So obviously, the senators and our corrupt government didn't really read this, and they just kind of forgot about it, right? Well, no. They work with the beast, and anything. I mean, when's the last time you ever heard of a senator get up and really tell the truth if they're a Christian country? Even about the foundations of our country? Never. Over the past several years, major religious scholars and leaders have attested to Alamo's deep religious convictions, whether or not they agree with his convictions. At the same time, Can's cult brainwashing construct has been debunked by the American Psychological Association, the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, and the American Sociological Association. Furthermore, the courts have repeatedly ruled that anti-cult and brainwashing testimony is inadmissible in court because it does not rely upon generally even substantially accepted scientific foundations. The IRS, however, never consulted with religious scholars or leaders to determine the validity of Pastor Alamo's religious theories, and what does the IRS know about them anyway? For that matter, Can's theories. They ignored a Supreme Court decision which recognized the legitimacy of the church, and they ignored the protections provided to the First Amendment activities against government interference or persecution. The IRS completely disregarded the missionary activities of this church and the fact that the church provided food, clothing, lodging, schooling, and jobs for its followers. The church's good works, such as taking young people off drugs and giving them faith in God and a reason to live, were also completely ignored. The IRS spent close to 20 years devising and imaginatively building a criminal case against Tony Alamo. They've been doing this for 20 years prior to that. They launched this persecution or investigation. They initiated 2 criminal investigations of Alamo, the first in 1973, and the next in 1975, and the second from 1997 to 1980, both of which were dropped after no criminal liability was found. Yet this didn't stop the IRS. And gives them their orders? Rome. They initiated a third investigation. In the middle of its criminal investigation, 2 former church members, Robert and Carrie Miller, hooked up with Can and its attorney Peter Giagridis and sued the church for supposedly stealing their trucking business. In actuality, the Miller brothers had been forced to leave the church after it was discovered that they embezzled $100,000 of church money. However, the judge in the trial was apparently taken by the frenzy of cult hysteria and sensationalized hostile news accounts about Alamo and took the case to trial without Alamo or any representatives from the church present. He, in his wisdom, or in his corruptness, issued a $1.4 million default judgment against Alamo, stating the church workshops and businesses, including the trucking business, were alter egos of Tony Alamo. In other words, Alamo followers were brainwashed, and Pastor Alamo controlled all church-run activities. After the trial, the government went a step further and indicted Alamo for threatening to kidnap the judge in the case, Morris S. Arnold. The government literally based their case on one newspaper account. Alamo had merely publicly criticized the judge's decision. Well, we can't criticize anything, can we, anymore? No. But the media hype was bordering on hysteria. The case went to a jury trial, and Alamo was immediately acquitted. Amazing. To me, incredible. The Millers were to become the government's key witnesses against Alamo, and as we will see later, the IRS withheld from the defense its financial relationship with the Millers. So they got to, basically what this group is saying is, look, you can't just forge documents and railroad somebody and frame them. Oh, no? They did. And they did it again in 2008. And this just gives you an idea. And I say the reason why comes down to the Vatican. With this as a backdrop, because if we had a Christian organization running this, if we were really a Christian country, we would realize that religious freedom is important. Religious freedom is only important to the Vatican so that they can control you and use it against you. That's the reason. And all you got to do is look at all their cases that get hidden away, never get talked about, and overlooked, and all of their criminal activity that they can be involved in, and never get any type of retribution or never any kind of publicity. But you take a Christian ministry like this, and it's all over the place, isn't it? With this as a backdrop, in June of 1990, the IRS issued a jeopardy assessment claiming Alamo owed $745,000 in personal income tax for years 1997 and 1980. And church-owned workshops owed $5 million in corporate income taxes and $1.6 million in unpaid employees withholding taxes. On June 11, the IRS seized church property in Nashville, Tennessee, including the famous Alamo of Nashville store, along with its inventory and church records. Well, hell, why don't they go to the Vatican? Just take over the Bank of America, too, that the Vatican owns. That's just one of their... Can you imagine what they own around the world? And all these crazy concordats? Hey, why don't I enter into a treaty with our government as a religious organization? No other group does that but the Vatican. Now, what the hell is that all about? I thought there was a separation of church and state. Well, as you can see, there isn't. The only separation comes when the state and the Vatican want to put any Christian believing churches out of business. Then there's a big separation. They don't want them around. And church-owned work, look, on June 11th, the IRS seized the property in Nashville, including that its Alamo store of Nashville, along with its inventory and church records. Alamo challenged the IRS in court, and Judge Thomas Wiseman abated the seizure and ordered the merchandise and records returned. However, instead of returning the property, the IRS turned everything over to Miller's attorneys, Peter Giorgitis, toward the $1.4 million judgment. Even though more than $1 million worth of property and merchandise had already been seized, the IRS staged a second raid. This was on February 13, 1991. 60 U.S. Marshals with guns drawn. Now what? Give me a break. See, we don't realize, folks, it's 2014. This is back in 1991, and it's only worse today. Hell, when they raided the Alamo Ministry in 2008, there were like 10 kids playing on swings, and there were 100, SWAT team guys with laser guns pointed at it. I mean, insane. 60 U.S. Marshals with guns drawn, accompanied by geodetists and IRS officials, stormed the church's Alma and Georgia Ridge, Arkansas communities, where over 200 families lived. They confiscated their homes, businesses, personal possessions, and all church property. My advice to them is, why don't you go to these rectories all over the country and all over the Jesuit foundations of Fordham and confiscate some of their stuff? Because I'll tell you, if you look deeply, they're involved in more criminal activity, their organization at the top levels, than any other in the history of the world. But you allow those, but go and take away the ministry's businesses, the personal possessions and church property of your fellow citizens, including 2 large office buildings containing all church records from the beginning of the ministry to the present. An estimated $50 million worth of property was taken. Several hundred families, including countless young children, were thrown out onto the street with only what they could carry. They lost all their personal belongings, their private homes, furniture, clothing, cars, all their cash, food, toys, school materials. One can only speculate that the government viewed these children as worthless, brainwashed zombies who did not deserve a roof over their heads. That's the kind of world you live in, folks. And it ain't any better today, and it's worse. The church made 7 legal attempts in 5 different courts to get back their records in order to properly defend Pastor Alamo. They failed, so they steal all their records. Well, what about all the think about Oklahoma City. Why they burned that thing down? Because they had all the Clinton records there. But these, Clintons and all those people are protected. But so they steal all the church records so that when they bring a charge against him, he doesn't even have his records to defend himself, and they won't give it back. The government disingenuously claimed that the church abandoned the records. However, church members were not allowed back on church property to get the records. Armed guards were at the gates. Telephone lines were cut, and offices sealed. Is this America? And where was media during this, supposed, look, if the media was really honest, they would have covered this and said, hey, man, our rights are being stripped away left and right. But no, they're covered. They're working for the Vatican. Trust me, I've worked in the media. I know how it operates. The Alamo Christian churches recently received, and this is back in the 90s, 40,000 pages of IRS documents through discovery process and through Freedom of Information requests. New IRS documents make plain that the IRS prosecuted Alamo because they decided he was a cult leader and not a religious leader. Now, I recommend when that Pope comes into this country, you start looking at the background of this organization. If there's ever a cult leader, it's this guy coming here in September. But everybody will worship him. The IRS attitude towards Tony Alamo was made clear in an IRS policy meeting on June 7th, 1990. And this is interesting. You got to listen to this. I got about 8 minutes. The IRS group manager, Ed Campbell, counseled 16 fellow agents on how to deal with cults. And, quote, on the nature of Alamo's organization followers as to their cult brainwashing nature. The IRS issued a background paper on Tony Alamo and his wife, which stated, through brainwashing, Tony and Susan Alamo required the associates to provide increasing amounts of free services to the foundation. Well, I'll tell you, if there's any people brainwashed, it's those people that follow the Pope who believe that statues actually bleed. People believe that, and they actually believe Mother Mary comes down and talks to people. Now, if anybody can brainwash people, it's those guys. That's okay, though, right? Oh, boy. What a world. IRS documents reference meetings between IRS agents and Cynthia Kisser, chair of CAN, Priscilla Coates, director of Los Angeles chapter of Cult Awareness and the cult committees of the Jewish Federation. The IRS, however, obviously recognizing the First Amendment implications of their cult baiting, agreed to have the term cult stricken from the court records. Oh, that's nice of them. Nonetheless, the cult brainwashing construct dominated the trial and was used by the probation officer to write Pastor Alamo's pre-sentence investigation report. The probation officer inserted every substantiated allegation made against him by every member of CAN. The report, the sentencing report, plagued Alamo throughout the prison system. He has been de facto jailed for crimes he has never been accused of or tried for in a court of law. He has been denied parole because of his allegations in the PSI. And prison authorities refused to move him to prison camp because of this pre-sentence arrangement. Newly discovered documents prove that the prosecutor knowingly concealed exculpatory material that he had a duty to disclose. Now, why doesn't this prosecutor ever... He should have been disbarred at that point. But that's not how the Bar Association works. You get close to the Vatican stuff, then you'll get yourself disbarred. During the trial, Prosecutor Belcher asked Agent Howlett if he ever received any ledgers from the MSC. Howlett answered, "No, sir. Newly discovered documents prove that the IRS had recovered these records from the church." Howlett knew this was true, and the prosecutor Belcher actually had these ledgers in his custody. Yeah, things that could have helped the defense prove Tony Pruitt, hey, I didn't do anything wrong, they keep. Yet the government portrayed Alamo as attempting to derail its investigation by the IRS, alleging they were unable to retrieve ledgers from the church when they had them already. Judge McCullough chose to what do you think he's going to believe? IRS agents, and used Alamo's supposed failure to turn over these ledgers as a major reason for sentencing him to the maximum time allowed. I think they got a call from somebody up in the Vatican saying, hey, look, just get this guy. We don't need any more criticism. Put him in jail forever. That's basically what goes on. And the rest of it, they got to figure out how to do it, and they never get caught. So we got a prosecutor who's withholding evidence. We got a witness who perjures himself, and we have a judge who realizes this and allows it to go on. That's your system of justice in a nutshell. And I'll tell you what, this is just, I've been trying to show you that this has been an ongoing persecution for years, and this isn't just limited to Tony. These guys are out looking for anybody else starting up ministries like this, anybody else that's going to be any kind of problem to this Vatican-led New World Order. And this is how they use the system. New evidence reveals that the prosecutor failed. Look at it. Oh, wait, I got to go back up here. In July 21, IRS memorandum written by Howlett to the case file indicated he possessed the ledgers, even wrote it down, and that the prosecutor Belcher knew about them. Quote, I explained that there was one such box, and that was box 16, containing the general ledgers. I mentioned that I was through with the ledger, and as far as I was concerned, they could take them. However, they were under the control of Belcher. On October 3rd, 1990, a letter to Alamo's attorney Neil Pendergraft, Howlett acknowledged that the ledgers had been received for some church activities. Alamo had no knowledge of such an agreement. What's his defense attorney doing? Maybe he's working with him too. Documents further show that the arrangement to move the records were done with the assistance of U.S. Marshal Rick Bean. New evidence reveals that the prosecutor failed to turn over these IRS memorandum of previous investigations of Alamo and all the records, and were discontinued for lack of wrongdoing. The IRS did not reveal information of prior investigations of Alamo that should have been turned over in the pretrial discovery. Such evidence would have allowed the defense to explore why previous investigations did not produce formal charges of criminal civil liability, and would have supported the defense's allegations of this government harassment. Seems to me like another railroad job, doesn't it? Yeah, another one. got railroaded with the IRS, and then in 2008 they finally did it. And the reason being, for his outspokenness on what the Bible says, his outspokenness about the real connection between the Vatican and our government. And a lot of this information goes on. I'll finish it up in the next couple of shows. And my whole point was to show you really what it's all about when you peel away the onion a bit and you see why they have taken a Christian ministry and done what they've done, and what they're going to do in the future, folks, to anybody else. Use this as an example, because that's what you're up against. And hopefully this kind of information helps you to deal with it. Okay, we'll be back tomorrow in the Investigative Journal. Have a good evening.